So I'll go ahead and start. I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Curt Bay. I'm the chair of the ATSU Arizona IRB. And what I want to tell you, I noticed several of you are here from Kirksville, and what I want to note is that the rules and processes that our IRB administrator will highlight shortly concern specifically the Arizona IRB. So we both, Kirksville and Arizona's IRB, operate under the same codified federal regulations, but our processes are local and so differ somewhat. So you won't find Brigit, our IRB administrator, who I'll introduce shortly, will highlight some parts of our Arizona website, but you will not find the appropriate documentation for Kirksville applications on our website. So I'd like to introduce Brigit Ciccarello. She's our Arizona IRB administrator. And most of faculty, staff, and student communication with the Arizona IRB, 95% plus, flows through Brigit. She knows more about federal regulations governing human subjects research than anyone I've ever known, probably more than anyone ever. She's just incredible. And she's a nice person too. Before joining us, not quite 2 years ago, right?
Right.
Yeah, Brigit was in human subjects administration for the Department of Defense for 12 years. So she knows this stuff inside and out. And we are incredibly lucky to have someone of her caliber on our staff. Brigit's also the university's federal-wide assurance representative. And the assurance in that title means that she's responsible for ATSU's compliance with federal regulations for the protection of human subjects research. All communication between ATSU and the Office of Human Research Protections in Washington goes through Brigit, so her role is very, very important. So Brigit, along with Gayla Sublett, our VP of Research and Sponsored Programs, Bob Theobald, the IRB chair in Kirksville, my vice chairs in Arizona, including Kathleen Matheson, Kelly Bliven, and Kenny Lamb, are responsible for the ethical conduct of human subjects research at ATSU. And we process between 300 and 400 applications per year. So keeps Brigit very, very busy. So I want, I will wind down here. I want to save time for, I hope, what will be many questions after Brigit's presentation. So Brigit, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I don't deserve that introduction, and I wish I knew more regulations than anybody I know, but I still talk to old colleagues sometimes when I have questions about what they may do at their universities and what their new understanding is and all types of stuff. But I will say, well, first of all, thank you. That was really a kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Bay, but also Dr. Bay and our primary IRB administrative board team, which is the four other people or three other people he mentioned. They are an exceptionally knowledgeable IRB compared to what I've seen with other academic IRBs, really fair-minded, really oriented toward helping our researchers and our students to do not only feasible research and help make it feasible, but to make sure we are compliant in a way that is not overwhelming, at least to the best of our ability. So we are really lucky to have such a knowledgeable IRB, because in academia, it really isn't that common to have such a knowledgeable board, because they academic IRBs are made up of volunteers who tend to not be professionals in regulatory professionals. But even in this case, not only do we have an exceptionally knowledgeable chair, we even have one of our IRB administrative board members who has a certification in certified IRB professional. So we have a really good team. Having said all that, I know we have about 52 more minutes. Hopefully we can use this hour as needed. I'm going to give a presentation just to give a top-down approach about the regulations that we work within, and then based on that, what that means for the studies that you are either mentoring or planning for yourself or peers and such, and what that actually looks like as far as the process goes, best practices for that, what topics you have to consider to make it feasible under the regulations, and what types of things you'll see from us. So having said that, I'm going to do a share screen because I want to show you these slides. And I think most of you got these slides, but I'm going to go through them real quick. There's some at the end that say, please basically print these off or save these for reference, because you'll see those topics come up most. But before we get there, I'm going to go into a couple of the acronyms that we use, and of course, an IRB is an institutional review board. If you're using a commercial IRB, which doesn't happen often here, although sometimes the dental school does with a pharma sponsored study. So those commercial IRBs are sometimes called an independent review board, but most people just know it's institutional review board. Of course, the PI is the principal investigator or the primary researcher. ICF, I'm always mentioning the ICF, and sometimes I forget to actually explain that that means the research informed consent form. And then a federal wide assurance, of course, is that federal document that institutions and researchers sign with the federal government that says, yes, we will follow regulations, ethical principles from specifically the Belmont report, and the other things that substantiate those guidances for us. And slide 3 here, this is just some specific differences as far as regulations are concerned on how we sometimes need data recorded. We don't have to go through these too much right now, but these are important sometimes because whether or not they're recorded anonymously or totally anonymous can make something exempt or not exempt in the research. And we'll go through that later, but I just want to make sure that we have these up here. And of course, an institutional review board, I'm sure you all know, but we'll just go over this real quickly, is a group of people that a minimum of 5 members that reviews, approves, and monitors research involving human subjects. And these were established through federal regulations by the feds so that not all research had to go to a central federal office. So IRBs basically have proxy authority on behalf of the federal government to enforce federal regulations. So at ATSU, I don't think we are doing many FDA studies, at least not that come through our office. So we use non-FDA regulations because those are centered mostly around investigational devices and new drugs. So we use something called the Common Rule, which is 45 CFR 46. And that matters only because it's less stringent than FDA clinical trials for our type of human subjects research, even if it's students or faculty research or even fellows. But the same principles behind them and intentions behind the regulations tend to be the same, which is primarily the rights and welfare of a human subject, and then regulatory compliant data collection. And then I also mentioned the Common Rule because if you have or see research from a student or yourself in which you have a collaborator that could be from another federal office like the DOD or the VA, they also use their own version of Common Rules, but there is harmonization between the Common Rules in these federal offices. So they're all called the Common Rules with just different numbers, and sometimes more than one Common Rule set of regulations applies. And we'll go through that later, but just want to give the definition of research because it matters for the federal regulations in regard to research that is regulated by the feds. So they consider it a systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And this matters when we start to look at things that are research but not human subjects research, or it can matter when we are looking at something that is more of a program evaluation or QA/QI project versus research. So just keep that in mind as we get to the slides later. And then human research includes work with human data, human subjects, so the person themselves, or human anatomical substances like biospecimens, sometimes they're often called. And I did want to point out here some special study populations. just because we have seen these come up a couple of times, and prisoner or any type of detainee research is not allowed at ATSU because under federal regulations, you have to have a prisoner advocate on your board, and then they have their own subpart of federal regulations, as do children. So work with children, exempt or not, has their own special set of regulations and prohibitions. International populations can be difficult. So everything that you see with the orange writing here, those are allowed, but there's always something particular to them. So international populations can be difficult because you may have multiple sets of regulations, international harmonization practices, guidelines, and ministries of health oftentimes. So that can make a study more complicated. We also have special populations with pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. Those have their own set of subset of regulations. Student research or faculty research using real patients that are from or at a non-ATSU facility. Those have HIPAA considerations, regulations, and most of the time multiple IRBs involved. The DoD and the VA, they have their own set of regulations that are more stringent than the HHS common rules. So their common rules have a couple extra things. And then also special population can be ATSU students who are being contacted via email because there is a process through enrollment services in which that particular population has to be covered by other considerations. So FERPA can come into play and so on. And by the way, as we go through these, please feel free to ask me questions at any time. And hopefully at the end, you'll have some as well. And what I'm really hoping to hear is, what are you finding to be the most difficult thing about the IRB process? And can we address that for you? And what types of issues do you not know how to resolve? So whatever questions you may have, including even with a specific study you may be working on. So of course, human research non-compliance is a big deal because of personal privacy and rights and welfare of the human subject. So there are consequences such as losing federal funding, research privileges, fines. Sometimes research can be permanently terminated, let alone suspended, of course. I have 2 slide 9s. So this next slide 9, the research non-compliance can be loss of personal research privileges. Of course, journals can refuse to publish you. There are fines. And then if a criminal aspect is involved, of course, there can be jail time as well. And then even for the students as researchers, they can lose federal student aid. They may have a hard time publishing research results, and they can, of course, lose some academic credit. So we put these on here not to be alarmist, but because the research compliance part has to be taken seriously and applied correctly, which we try to do. So I apparently also don't have slide 11. So slide 12 here. A human subject is a subject in research that is a living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional student, conducts research in which they obtain information or biospecimens through an intervention or interaction, or they obtain, use, study, analyze, or generate identifiable information. And that can include private identifiable information like PII, which can be anything from a credit card number to a URL address, to protected health information, which of course is HIPAA regulated. Slide 13, this is a screenshot of our webpage for the ATSU Mesa IRB. So we have added tabs here. I put mostly exempt reviews highlighted because I'd say about 85% of our student research are exempt studies, and we'll go through some definitions and some examples and limitations of that in just a bit. But I did want to show you this screenshot of our webpage because we've added helpful tabs like the HIPAA barriers tab, which gives you 3 examples of if PHI or patients are being used. What are the options for you or the student using real patients or PHI at a different site beyond ATSU? We also have a tab here, recruiting ATSU students, and that has to do with how to contact enrollment services if you want access to student emails. The exempt review includes The exempt application itself, which by the way, we have a new version of as of just a few days ago. It is called version 25 August 2021, and that replaces the old version 5. Expedited reviews are non-exempt studies, as are full board reviews, and those just mean that they have to go to at least 2 IRB board members, and possibly up to the full board if it's a full board review, but that's not typical. Non-jurisdiction review tab has to do with students who want to do a literature review or a case study. Those are the only 2 instances they can use that form. Faculty can use it in other situations like such as a QA/QI project if they wish. Getting research consent is the typical information about how you obtain consent for research compared to other type of consenting. The investigator tab just has some basic information for the investigators, and the IRB training tab actually gives links to the federal websites, but there's also a longer training version, a PDF form on the right of that page that it provides some more robust training. But and this slide set is actually based on that training, but we've whittled it down for what we think will cover the majority of ATSU research. Again, this is just an overview of the form. So we have non-jurisdiction form, the exempt review application, and the non-exempt application. Here's a live link. So if you all have a copy of these slides, which I think that you do, this is our live link that you can direct students and of course yourselves to the reference as you are writing up your research studies. And starting with slide 15 here, we're going to go over the IRB approvals and determinations. And I just want to clarify the reason why we use the word determination sometimes instead of approvals is because if something isn't fully regulated or long-term regulated, we tend to use the word, it got an exempt determination. I mean, sometimes we'll say approval, but it just means that it's been determined that it meets the exemption criteria and doesn't have to be regulated beyond the exempt determination by the IRB. But the researcher nor the student or researcher can make that exempt determination for themselves. It always has to be documented and logged in the IRB files. Slide 16 talks about the non-jurisdiction form. Again, students can only use this form for single case studies and public literature review. And this is just because the information we often need from students, we just can't typically get from a non-jurisdiction form, and we trust and are able to see that faculty can use that non-jurisdiction form better and in more appropriate cases than the student researchers can. So we always, if it doesn't meet one of these 2 options, we just direct them to use the exempt form. And if it turns out that they filled out the exempt form and we still think it's something that doesn't have to be regulated, we will still give it a non-jurisdiction form when it's appropriate. So if they fill out the exempt form and we know that they're really doing QA/QI work, we will go ahead and give them that determination, even if they didn't use the non-jurisdiction form. To clarify, we need a non-jurisdiction form for systematic review. Okay, so Dr. Wolf, do we need to do a non-jurisdiction form for systematic review? I'm not totally sure what you mean by systematic review, but do you just mean a public literature search? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I thought I'd heard you say that. I was just clarifying.
I think for faculty, if they know they're just doing a literature review, that they don't have to go through the IRB. But Dr. Bay, do you know if there's a policy on faculty submitting for a literature review through? Do we know?
Well, we have in the past had them submit a non-jurisdiction application for a systematic review, which is by definition public literature, no contact with subjects. And that's simply for documentation purposes in case they want to publish or present the systematic review. They will have to submit documentation to the journal or to the conference indicating that the IRB has determined the research to be approved. So yeah, we do encourage that.
Okay. Does that help?
Thank you.
All right. Slide 17. My computer's having a little delay here. So this is basically what the non-jurisdiction form looks like. Very simple information that we're asking about on page 1. Page 2 just talks about hints about HIPAA regulations, QA, QI research, but very easy to fill out and self-evident. Slide 18. This is about the exemption form that's students and faculty use for their research. Again, I use the exemption form for students doing QA, QI projects so that we can actually get all of the information we need to make sure that meets all of the regulations. And of course, for the regular exempt studies, and we'll talk about this next on slide, I guess the next slide. So just real quick on slide 19, and this is good reference when you're trying to think about the difference between a QA, QI project or a program evaluation versus actual research, at least according to federal regulations. And more or less, QA, QI activities, they tend to lack a systematic investigation where you are not trying to contribute to generalizable knowledge within your scientific field. You're trying to, and the expectation is that the intent is to directly affect or benefit the site-specific individuals or an institution. It's also intended only to help or improve that particular agency's outcomes, practices, policies, processes, and so on. Now, this sounds like, but yeah, this also can be research too. You're right, that research and QA, QI sometimes overlap, but from a regulatory point of view, we know which one it is depending on what the structure of the project is, how the data are being obtained, what they're being used for, and so on. And then if we have questions about it, we simply put that in our review. Slide 20, this is the exemption form. And we have, of course, the instructions in red text, but we have tried to make this more robust over the last, I'd say, at least 15 months, so that we're getting more information. We also added some mandatory conflict of interest training on there. And I want to make a point about there is a section, if you can see in this screenshot, there's a highlighted section in the middle of page 2 that says conflict of interest, and it talks about the FCOI. And some people have said, well, I don't know, have I taken the institutional financial conflict of interest? And if you've done your city training, that is integrated into that training. So Dr. Bay, is there anything else to say about that? Or is that what you usually hear about that question as well? Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Bay. Oh, Dr. Bay, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I had nothing to add, but Dr. Olgendi had a question.
Oh, all right.
I responded to a couple of them, but just to clarify, does the IRB filled by students or faculty? Is that membership, Dr. Olgendi?
No, I mean just the IRB, the application of the IRB. Are we supposed to just direct the student to work on the IRB and fill it out and we just supervise them? Or are we as a faculty or a principal investigator supposed to fill these, the IRB forms?
No, just for practice and experience, I prefer the students to take a crack at it, but the more closely you can mentor them, I mean, without doing the work for them, the better, because then they will have learned how to complete an IRB application. But we do like to see the applications mentored.
Thank you. That's a good clarification, because I think it will be, in my mind, this is part of the student education and part of their experience. So it will be a good idea for the student to fill these IRB, but we are supervising them and help them out. So I just wanted to make sure that it's not the principal investigator job to fill it out and just be the principal investigator. It can be between the students and the principal investigator too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's why I need Dr. Bay. I would not know how to answer that question because I'm not a faculty member. Thank God. Thank you, Dr. Bay. I appreciate that. So and by the way, we're about to go through the difference in some prohibitions having to do with exempt research. I just wanted to go through these forms real quick. On slide 21, there we go. I just want to talk about that. When we talk about research that is exempt and research that is non-exempt, we are talking about categories. So as most of you know, exempt research is a risk-based set of regulations that are low risk, so not greater than minimal risk. And the feds basically define that by saying, look, if the risk is similar to an average American day for an average citizen or an average doctor's visit, no more than a single blood draw, or yeah, that's minimal risk. And exempt studies are oftentimes even less than minimal risk, but there is no official category that's less than minimal risk. So they put them in these low risk categories called exempt categories. There are 8, but we tend to only use 4 of them, as do most institutions in the United States. So we tend to use the survey, the educational strategies, the benign behavioral interventions that can also include surveys or interviews, or de-identified data sets, and that's category 4, and that can be HIPAA regulated and so on. But I just want to make a point about this little note at the bottom where I say exempt research is categorically human research, but it's exempt for further regulatory oversight beyond its exempt determination by the IRB. And the reason why I put that is because over the years, I've heard many investigators say, well, I'm not doing human subject research regulated by the feds because it's exempt. Well, it is exempt from further regulatory oversight, but it is still human subject research. It still meets the definition, which is why IRBs give that determination, even though it's real low risk research. Because what the feds ask us to do is to use their guidance. We're going to talk about the new federal regulations that are now in full effect. They finally went into full effect last year, but we have a lot of new guidance on that. I'm going to look at this question real quick. I was told by a faculty at HSU that IRB should be filled by faculty and not a student. So this is good. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not a question. Thank you very much. All right. I don't know why my computer keeps locking up here. Slide 22, the non-exempt form, the beginning of it looks like the exempt form, but it is far more robust in the prompting of sections that we need filled out and the detail that we need, including asking about enlisting all the potential vulnerable populations that are what I call lowercase vulnerable, not capital, or lowercase v vulnerable, not capital V vulnerable, like the subset of regulations are for children, prisoners, and women and fetuses. They have their own subset of regulations, but you can still have vulnerable populations such as ATS students doing research as a subject with a faculty member, or sometimes homeless or impoverished populations can be considered vulnerable. It depends on what the role is in a particular study. Sometimes the elderly can be considered a vulnerable population. Sometimes non-English speaking groups can be considered a vulnerable population. And the federal regulations and guidance ask us to just make sure that when we see studies involving those populations that we're covering all considerations, extra considerations that they may need to protect their identity, their rights, and their welfare. Slide 23, non-exempt. And the only reason, I'm going to go back up here. The reason why I put only minimal risk for non-exempt, and I didn't include a non-exempt greater than minimal risk slide, is because we have yet to see a greater than minimal risk study that is being regulated by the ATSU Mesa IRB. For studies that are greater than minimal risk that we may have that are sponsored by industry, those tend to be a couple in the dental department, and they go through a centralized commercial IRB. And Dr. Bay, have you seen in years many greater than minimal risk studies at ATSU at all?
Very few.
Yeah, okay. So we're really only going to be talking about minimal risk studies whether they're exempt or non-exempt. So non-exempt research, I cannot do a single review. It does have to go to 2 IRB members in addition to myself, where I usually do a pre-review on it, and then it has a documented review for it from at least 2 IRB members. Slide 24. Again, these are the regulatory subcategories that I mentioned before. So subpart B is the additional protections for pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. Subpart C is the additional protection for prisoners. We don't do that here. Subpart D, and we do this here, is research protection for children, in which the protections for children also apply to exempt research, unlike research with adults. I'm going to look at this chat here. We have a question. Students at ASDA are required to work closely with their faculty mentor to complete, oh, hi, Dr. Spillart, to complete the IRB application. Student-driven research projects. If students are co-investigators on a faculty-driven research project, they are strongly encouraged to work on the IRB submission with the PI, but the faculty and the PI is responsible for ensuring that the contents of the application are accurate and complete. All student applications from ASDO must be approved by me prior to submission to the IRB. Thank you for that. Dr. Who, analysis of existing lab data and clinical information post-mortemly without performing any additional tests and write a case report. Is that considered exempt? So let me just answer Dr. Who's question here. Only with the DoD would you have to get approved for research with basically cadavers, because they have special regulations that cover cadavers, because the current regulations only cover living individuals from whom, you know, there's an interaction or intervention. But because the military does not want people to think that they are doing experiments with deceased bodies while they're in military custody, they don't allow it. So that's the only exception I know of. So exempt in this case, it would only apply to lab data, and even that, I'm looking at analysis of existing lab data. There would have to be some type of identifier on it and would have to be from a current living person, not from a cadaver. So I'd have to see more information on that, but it wouldn't even meet the definition probably of human subjects research if it's from a cadaver, let alone be even in the category of exempt. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, we would consider that non-jurisdiction.
Right. And for people who have worked with other IRBs, non-jurisdictions are sometimes called NHU determinations or no human use determinations, but we use the term non-jurisdiction to imply within the name that this is not within the jurisdiction of the IRB to regulate. Sorry, I'm going to open this chat again. Thank you. No live person involved. Okay, great. Slide 25. So the problems we usually find are getting official final signed off submissions with no study title or sometimes no required signatures. And they are required from the student researcher, the faculty member or the faculty mentor, and the chair of the department. We also see little or no confidentiality measures described, and this is probably, besides assuring that there's voluntary participation in any research, this is probably the most important issue to have written well and detailed in a protocol submission document that we give you all the IRB application to use in place of a separate protocol. But the confidentiality part is really important. The regulations wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for protecting the confidentiality rights and welfare of these subjects or participants. We also see incomplete and inadequate forms and information. So if the consent form doesn't match the protocol for the risk section, or if they're saying the purpose of the research is one thing in the protocol, or the IRB submission form says another, I mean, you name it, even the number of subjects participating or the time listed that it takes to participate in the study could be different. So that could be an issue. An issue for us when, for this fourth point here, when an application comes in, it's not submitted as a single PDF. This matters because we want everything in one finalized document. And also when I get when the board gets multiple documents in, we have to start creating files for the students and renaming them. And we don't want to do that. We want to be able to receive a document, file it as it is, without basically interfering with the submission itself. Or sometimes, actually a lot of times I see that students will forward emails, especially the Anita Franklin emails about the city certifications. Well, they'll just forward it and say, hey, see the email below. But since that email is part of their file, their auditable, final, formal file, we want them to, I don't care if they take a screenshot and then just turn it into a PDF, but we want them to make a file out of that. And it sounds small, but when you get 300 of those, we're making a lot of emails into files. slide 26. So here's where I put, save or print these slides. Oh, I didn't change the slide number. Sorry about that. Ignore that it says slide 22 and 25. And what's really sad is I reviewed these slides many times and I still miss that, so I apologize. But the next few slides, please save these for reference and look at them as you are either designing your own research or looking at student research, because these issues mentioned next really tend to matter because they tend to be the most frequent issues that we see, and it delays especially the student researchers within their short time that they have to do their project. It delays their project because we have to kind of go back and help them get things lined up to be regulatorily compliant. And that takes away time and makes their life easier, and they're already stressed because research is stressful and they don't know the regulations, then they are hard. And even with the change in the common rule, that totally finally the enforcement for the new common rule only went into effect January of 2020, and they were officially processed and made official in 2018. And that's because there were so many questions about the new language that there's even new guidance on what can be done and exempt studies under the new exemption parameters and so on. So it can be complicated even for the IRB. So we hope that will be easier for the students once they start seeing things that we've written here on the next few slides, but also as they see the new forms where we're prompting them to give us information that they may not have thought of themselves. So the first issue that we see in our regulatory submissions are a student researcher, for instance, let's say they're a PA, they're already a practicing PA at a hospital ambulatory clinic or something that they work at, and they want to do their research there. If that site already has an IRB, for instance, like the Banner research facilities in the Phoenix area, because there's already another IRB regulating those sites, those patients, the HIPAA regulations, the federal research regulations, ATSU always has to be the second IRB to approve the study on behalf of the student. And that is because, according to the feds, the site IRB presumes primary regulatory authority over their own site, their own patients, their own electronic medical records, and so on. So if a student knows that they have a local IRB, they submit to us, they didn't get their local IRB approval, we will direct them to do so. There are exceptions sometimes where we can work around that, but for the most part, their sites say, hey, we need to look at this. If this work is being done here, if data are being collected here, if patients are being part of some ATSU student research, without exception, just assume that the local IRB has to approve their study first. The sub point here, sites and HIPAA. This is especially crucial for students who use protected health information or PHI or non-ATSU patient populations and sites. And this is really important. The reason why I specifically point out HIPAA here is HIPAA is both a criminal issue and a civil issue. So unlike other research issues that are just a regulatory thing, it would be very difficult to turn them to a criminal matter. HIPAA is the one exception because the Department of Justice has decided that identifiable information for a particular person, let alone a patient, is not just their asset that you don't necessarily have a right to in order to conduct your research, but it's also a liability. So that's the one issue where we have civil and criminal overlapping, generally speaking. Slide 28, sites with no HIPAA considerations. For research sites used by ATSU students and faculty whose research does not include patients or PHI, if that site has an IRB, they still have to give approval for that ATSU researcher because they, by virtue of the fact that they even exist. So if an IRB exists at somebody else's site, if they exist, they have primary authority. I want to also mention that most academic institutions also have a policy that regardless of whether their faculty member may be doing a research project for ATSU. Let's say they're an ATSU doctoral student and they're a faculty member somewhere else. Most sites say you still have to get approval from us because you are our affiliate, and our IRB has still has default regulatory authority over you. And that sounds like, wow, that's a lot of work, but it's not if the person knows that up front, because again, research does tend to be for doctoral students, medical students, and other students tends to be exempt style research. So an exemption approval from a local IRB should not be too hard to get. And if you don't know how to contact or find a local IRB for that site, I can certainly help you do that. But usually it's just Googling it. This third point here for the program evaluations, QA and QI, even if you're not doing research, and we don't, the ATSU doesn't think ATSU IRB doesn't think you're doing research. If a site has an IRB, they also have to look at it and agree that student or that researcher is also doing QA/QI work and not research. So, and that is just because they want to make sure that all of the correct regulations are not only being applied, but actually are being interpreted correctly. Does anybody have any questions about these last few points on slide 28? My little bar went away. All right, let's go to slide 29. Sites with no IRB. Okay, so and let's talk about student researchers here. So if they, again, let's say they're a PA at a clinic, but that clinic does not have an IRB affiliated with it at all, and they do not hold that federal-wide assurance, which is that contract with the federal government that you will always do research according to policies and the Belmont principles. And they need an IRB to cover the project for that student or faculty member if they're engaged in at that site. We can do that for you. We'll just sign off on either an individual investigator agreement or a reliance, well, I guess a reliance agreement would be with another IRB. So sometimes we will prompt people on our submission forms when they might need an individual investigators agreement or an IIA. And if the student doesn't know that, we will know that once we get that submission, and we will be able to determine if that site is engaged in the research and they need to have regulatory coverage for which we can serve as the IRB. This little note down here asking if the site asks what's an FWA, that's a good sign that they don't have one and we can consider using an IIA. Dr. Bay, would you like to add anything at this point?
I just want to respond to a couple of the chats. Jane and Christine, one was about systematic reviews, the other was about scoping reviews. And those do not involve contact with human subjects, so they're not human subjects research. But in my experience, if you submit an application, a manuscript to a journal or an application to a conference to present the findings of your research, they will routinely ask you if whatever it is, whatever project you were engaged in was covered by an IRB. And they just send those out wholesale. They don't discriminate between human subject research and review type studies. Yep. So it's best if you have a non-jurisdiction finding determination in hand that you can send them or cite, because it puts us in a bit of a bind, because by law, we are not allowed to retroactively approve a project, whatever it is. So if you submit to a conference after having done a systematic review, you want to present it in a journal, say, they're going to come back and ask you, was there an IRB oversight? So then you come to us and we say, well, you've already done the project, so we can't do anything about it. But in truth, we would give you a non-jurisdiction determination, but it puts us in a bit of a bind. So it's best in both cases, systematic scoping reviews, to obtain a determination from the IRB before proceeding. That's the safest route.
Yes, thank you. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we had about, I think it was 6 or 7 students last year who had a blanket requirement for a conference that they went to where they had poster presentations for single case studies, which by definition is not research. There are very few exceptions to that, and they tend to do with very rare diseases and so on. But that's not going to happen at ATSU. And still, the conference said, "We don't care. You want your poster presentation up? You got to have an IRB determination on hand." So we had to review all of these case studies through the non-jurisdiction form and just give them that coverage for them, and it worked out fine. And it's not a big deal, but you'll see sometimes this over-regulation or overreacting to the requirements because nobody is sure where to draw the line, so they err on the side of caution, and even IRBs can do that. Sometimes we have to consider things that aren't categorically part of something to do with research, but we say, hey, this is a situation where we want to make sure that we're doing really robust reviews. And the point of me saying this is that under the federal regulations, sites or IRBs can do more than is required by the regulations, just not less. Now, nobody would ever want to do that because it's more work for you and more work for the researchers, but that can happen in certain instances if it comes up for some reason.
Yeah, if this sounds complicated, it is complicated. It's way more complicated than, Brigit this is IRB 101. But when the feds issue a new regulation, or in fact, regulations that have been on the books for years, the guidance that they publish, that the OHRP, the Human Subjects Office, FDA, DOD, VA, the guidance for how to interpret and use the regulations absolutely dwarfs the actual regulations. And those things just appear for no good reason that I can determine every day.
Yep. It comes up all the time. So I'm on these live forums where the industry leaders or the regulatory leaders are, can talk about, start a discussion or post new guidance. And there's even a formal guidance committee called SACHARP that informs the regulations. And we're talking about exempt regulations where they had an explanation this long about what they meant about benign in the exemption for benign behavioral interventions. So if you think it can sound complicated, it's true, it can. If you're not a regulatory professional, it just would be, I think, totally overwhelming. So hopefully our forms, our reviews, our prompting, and our guidance helps make all of this easier for you and for the students.
Just one more thing. These guidances are not law, but you better pay attention to them.
Yeah, and if you do different from the guidance, you probably should have a written justification as to why, because if you get audited, they're going to say, well, why was your way better than the federal guidance on this? You kind of have to justify everything. So slide 30 here, this is just a couple of things that just to help me. It would be really appreciated if submissions, especially after they've been converted into one PDF, are not done so by scanning them, because a lot of the times the IRB, myself, and the other core board members need to copy and paste wording, and if it's scanned, we either have to type it out or try to convert it back to Word. So if you can avoid that, that would be great. As far as scanning goes for the signature pages, feel free to scan those. And to be honest, you can sign electronically using the Adobe digital signature. You can sign using, touch screen ways. It doesn't have to be a wet ink signature. During COVID, because of the lack of interaction, personal interaction on campus, a lot of people are signing using basically confirmatory email saying that this is in place of a signature. So we have options here. And the good news is, even the feds have decided for signing consent forms where signed consent forms are required, because it's not always required. Because of COVID, out of the blue, they said, hey, wet ink signatures for consent forms are way too hard right now because people are not interacting with each other, and for good reason. ways in which they would make us justify, areas in which they would make us justify before not getting a wedding signature. They just across the board said, hey, if you need to get digital signatures, if you need to do it through emails, if you need to use a touch screen, go ahead and do it. They aren't even fighting it at this point. Now, it still has to be done correctly, as if it requires a signature. You know, at least have something that says that they consented to it. I mean, you can't just get rid of a consent form just because some changes on whether or not it's a wedding signature has come into play. But things are changing even in the last 3 months. So it's not just in the last year. The second point for file naming is that in this black text you see here, this is the name. This is the name of our template, the IRB exempt review application, or it was for the old template. This was the name of the form. And most of the students keep that name and they all submit the same name files. So I always have to, or the board members have to kind of distinguish it from all the other files with the same name. So again, if you could, it would just be helpful if the students named their submissions with their last name, their faculty advisor last name, maybe what school or department they're in, the general date, and then some abbreviated version of what their study is. And this is not required, but it's just helpful for filing, saving time, and then not changing a document that was submitted. So this is the last slide. This is how you always get a hold of us. So we have 5 people who have access to the Mesa IRB email. I tend to respond the most, but this is our centralized email. And you can send submissions, questions, all of that to the IRB. And having said what I've said now, does anybody have any particular questions about their study, a study they're working on, or the regulations and definitions themselves? And is this even helpful for information that you're passing on to your students?
Thank you really very much for this presentation. It was really helpful to me personally to go through it. If we want to contact you, and for example, if we are doing a research where we are scanning a patient mouth multiple times, do we need to apply for the longer IRB, or do we go for the shorter one? Or is that, can we email you about that, or how do we go about it?
Yes, if you're not sure, you can email the Mesa IRB email and we'll take a look at what was presented to us in the email. Sometimes I'll just say, hey, give me a call. Let's actually discuss it so that you can explain it to me verbally, which could be different than what I'm reading. If you also don't know, the first thing I would do is go to our webpage, open our most recent consent form, open our most, not consent form, exempt form. Look at the, yeah, so if you open that exemption form, look at the 4 categories of the research. If you think it meets one of those categories, then you're probably okay to move forward. If you look at those categories and go, oh, I don't know if it would quite fit within one, go ahead and ask us. But the easiest way to tell is to look up the criteria that we have listed for the 4 mainly used exemption categories.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. Is anybody more confused now that they've heard this information? Is this somehow overwhelming in regards to how you apply it in any way to your student research or your own research?
Brigit, can I ask a question for clarification? So for the OT doctoral capstone experiences, they're often at a site and maybe implementing an intervention to see how it works, or looking at an assessment, but it's part of their routine OT eval and/or treatment. Is that usually exempt, or is that maybe a minimal risk?
Well, it depends. I hate to say this, but it depends, because the exemption categories, and I'm thinking for what you just described, seems like exemption category 3, which is benign behavioral interventions. But then when I go back and read the federal guidance, which is of course this long, they start to say, but if it's more than a few hours or more than just one day, or if it's, you know, whatever the case may be, something along those lines, it will start to, you know, push it one way or the other. So it just depends on what the risk is, what part is the research, because if they're just getting some data collection from something they would be doing anyway, and that part isn't research, that just may make it, you know, category 2 or category 4. So it just depends on the details of the research.
We'll have to talk about one in particular.
Okay. Okay. How can we conduct a human subject study with respect to COVID restrictions per the IRB? I'm not totally sure what's meant by that question. Are you talking about doing COVID research or doing any research during COVID? Pedopathy, Dr. Pedopathy? Any research, okay. Well, as of this spring, we did get a green light to go ahead and, generally speaking, move forward with some, of course, in-person research. But I hate to say this again, but it also depends. If COVID restrictions, if we need more information about COVID parameters, COVID safety issues for a particular study due to the nature of the study, the IRB will ask for it. We'll probably get some more clarification from the higher ups soon on that. But all of the previous studies that were on hold or were told not to pursue have already gotten the green light. I think the last one was May. So we are, generally speaking, okay moving forward doing research during COVID. Does that answer the question? All right, I'm sorry, somebody was going to just ask something.
I wanted just to add to the question around capstones. I think that one's going to be a little tricky, and depending on the types of capstone projects our students will be doing, it may require maybe a departmental or program review of some of the capstone projects proposals before they are actually done. I thank you for clarifying between the quality improvement and for you know, administering surveys. Those are, I think, where the IRB review will definitely be involved and necessary. So I appreciate that part. But I think more information on capstones, I think, would be helpful because our speech and language program will be requiring capstone projects as well as theses and other research projects.
Christine, we've seen capstones that range from randomized controlled trials to case studies. So yeah, we'll have to, you know, again, it depends. It always depends.
Always depends. I also wanted to make note too, and everybody please keep this in mind, about a third of the way down on our webpage for the exempt research, on that tab, you'll see a large, long description of the differences and comparisons between what constitutes a QA/QI/PE project versus a federally categorized human research project. So there's a large description on that page that I think will be pretty helpful. So just always keep in mind that you can always go back to that page and start looking at the differences.
Yeah,
anybody else?
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to ask if anybody else had more questions.
Yeah, we have some nice resources that Brigit's put together on the site, the IRB site, for trying to distinguish between QA, QI, and research. And we often will go back and forth ourselves trying to determine whether this study is jurisdiction or not jurisdiction, because sometimes it's just so difficult and it depends again on so many things.
Yeah. And when we couldn't figure one out last year because we would go down one route of assessment and then another one, and we just couldn't decide. We actually just gave up, contacted the federal office, and you know what they ended up telling us? Whatever the IRB decides, we will honor, because this could go either way. So it was like, okay, all right.
That was so disappointing.
It was so, yeah. The good news is what we wanted to make sure that we got in writing from them was that they agreed this could have gone either way, and that if we got audited, they would more or less support our substantiation for the determination that we made, which was a QA/QI, not research project. And they said, yes, absolutely, because they too are trying not to have this perception or actions that they do that is perceived or feels like, a stranglehold where everybody feels nickel and dimed, but you still have to get it right. So we really do everything we can to make it the most efficient, easiest, and compliant process possible.
Yeah, we've gone over time, and thanks for sticking around, and thanks for the great attendance today. It's wonderful to see everyone here, but we probably should let you go now. In case,
Thank you.
unless anyone has any other questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.